Welcome back. Well, for those of you who have been watching our show since the beginning of the pandemic, you'll know the city Nuremberg. It's a German city. It's a city that had several touch points with the Nazi regime. The so-called Nuremberg laws were a system of racial laws that said what, for example, Jews could or couldn't do, including whether or not they could be doctors, whether or not they could marry non-Jews, the Nuremberg laws. After the Holocaust, the Nuremberg trials put the Nazis on trial for crimes against humanity. Emerging from that was something called the Nuremberg Code. One of the outcomes of those trials was to review what doctors had done during the Nazi regime, especially in concentration camps, in death camps. Dr. Mengele, for example, who conducted atrocious, torturous experiments on Jews and others, horrific experiments on twins, for example, positively infecting Jews with diseases to study it. Doctors did the most diabolical things, and it helped whitewash what the Nazis were doing. The Nuremberg trials and the Nuremberg Code, emanating from the Holocaust, set forth our modern understanding of medical ethics, including what rights the patient had to not just consent, but to informed consent and ongoing consent, and the right to remove that consent. That's what the Nuremberg Code is. And it's relevant to anyone who has studied the last 2 years as patients, ordinary Canadians, have had their informed consent removed, as Canadians have been pressured into taking vaccines. Some of them took them willingly, but many did not want to and were coerced into doing so. Did it touch upon the Nuremberg Code? Well, it most certainly did. And Leslyn Lewis, one of the candidates for the Conservative Party of Canada, mentioned this in a mass email the other day, which I thought was very thoughtful and very bold and very principled. But people who know less than her about the meaning of the Nuremberg Code pounced, claiming that she was diminishing the Holocaust somehow by referring to it. Just the opposite. She was remembering the Holocaust and the lessons from it that too many have forgotten too soon. I saw another leadership candidate, Scott Aitchison, went on the hunt, claiming that Leslyn Lewis was intolerant somehow for referring to it. Brian Lilly, the disgraced former rebel, now with Toronto Sun, said that Leslyn Lewis' comments were unacceptable. No, Brian is wrong yet again. And I thought I would invite Dr. Lewis on the show to talk about the Nuremberg Code, how it's appropriate to refer to it in the case of medical ethics, and why I think she was right and her critics were wrong. Dr. Lewis joins me now via Skype from her home in Dunnville, Ontario. Dr. Lewis, great to have you on the show. We're fans of yours all the time, but I felt pricked into action here. I felt that you were unfairly smeared. Did I more or less accurately sum up the background story?
Yes, I think you did, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you about what the purpose of that birthday wish to the Nuremberg Code was. So that comms that I put out, Ezra, was on the birthday of the Nuremberg. And I really wanted to highlight just how Canada has deviated from that and how we should be careful, because that code, we don't need to have another Holocaust. And I pray to God that we will never have anything so brutal and egregious as the Holocaust for us to actually invoke the code and to learn from it again. I believe that the code is an international legal principle that came out of one of the worst dehumanization of people, to the point where people would say, well, the Jewish people, some of them, their skin were the same color as the people who were oppressing them. But the hatred was so deep that they created a racial group and said these people are different, and measured the size of their heads and did atrocious things. Mm-hmm. That wasn't really what I was focused on. I was focused on the legal principle that came out of that, so that we would never do that again. And so I took that legal principle and I looked at whether or not Canada deviated from it. And I looked at the experiments that we conducted on young indigenous children, and so many things were so wrong with that experiment. Even when the children were deemed to be malnourished and doctors wanted to intervene and give them vitamins, the authorities, our government, said no, because they are part of a control group. And you will ruin the experiment. So they watch these children suffer. And I wanted to highlight that. And the reason why I highlighted the two other cases is because I know that then sometimes people will go down the path of saying, oh, well, you know, our country's so bad. No, our country is the greatest country in the world. And we learn from our mistakes. And we are not perfect. And that's why we need to analyze our history rather than tear it down. And that's why I highlighted the Willowbrook case and Tuskegee, because in Willowbrook, the parents also thought that, actually the doctor said that the parents were given consent, even though those parents were told that if you don't sign on to this program for your children, these experiments, we won't treat your children. We won't give them, they won't be able to stay in this hospital. So those parents were compelled, and they didn't know that the children were being injected with hepatitis. So they didn't even know what the source of the injection was. Same thing with Tuskegee, Ezra. In the Tuskegee experiment, both black and white men were treated. The white men were treated and the black men were given placebos and watched and then sent out in the community to infect others. And children were born with syphilis and were told, and these men suffered dramatically. And when they went to other doctors, the doctors were not permitted to treat them. They were told that they would lose their license if they treated these men, because once again, same as in Canada, they were part of a human experiment, and they were a control group. And so they could not be treated. And this is egregious, Ezra. And on the birthday of Nuremberg, I thought it was very important to highlight it. Now, a few of my supporters contacted me and said, oh, you didn't mention COVID. And they were very disappointed, because to be honest with you, Ezra, the purpose of the post wasn't about COVID at that time. It was to highlight how fragile our rights can be, and how something as important as the legal instrument of the Nuremberg Code was deviated on three occasions in North America for decades.
You know what? Those cases are fascinating and terrifying. I'm familiar with the Tuskegee case. They literally injected men with syphilis, claimed to be helping them, but did not. As you said, they let them get sicker and sicker as part of a grotesque experiment, clearly violating the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code was part of the verdict in these crimes against humanity trials. Like the judges contemplated what the doctors had done and said no doctor should ever do that again. It's interesting you say some of your supporters said, why didn't you mention COVID? If you are standing by the Nuremberg principles, people can infer how this applies to our own situation. Right now, literally right now, the University of Western Ontario is saying to young, healthy men and women who already had 2 shots, if you don't get the 3rd shot, which, by the way, is not health policy anywhere in this country, just some bureaucrats said, if you don't get this 3rd health shot, regardless of whether your doctor advises it, we will punish you by banishing you from this university. That is so clearly against the Nuremberg Code. And I think the reason there was a freak out by Brian Lilly and Scott Aitchison is because you're speaking the plain truth. And instead of explaining why the 3rd booster shot should be mandatory, they just want to throw insults at you instead. I think anyone who remembers the Nuremberg Code and the Nuremberg trials is doing a better service to the memory of the Holocaust than people who say, how dare you invoke them. I don't know. I was very proud of you and very glad that you talked about it.
Well, thank you, Ezra. I never invoked the Holocaust. I don't believe that you can compare anything to it. Just like chattel slavery, I never compare anything to it, because the grotesqueness of what happened, it's just, it's incomparable. And so I never invoke it. I was trained as an international lawyer. So a legal principle coming out of a trial is something that I would always engage in. And legal principles are historical precedents. It sets the parameters of how we should behave. And so it's very, very logical on the eve of the Nuremberg Code to bring up these things. And so I don't know why they were so angry with me, but I do know that people like Mr. Aitchison, they have a lot of bigotry around social conservatives. And when people who support me are referred to like the fringe, it just tells them. And to be honest, on the 10th, we will see who the fringe is. We will see whether or not I just have a fringe representation. And I'm convinced that we don't. There are a lot of people who have questions, Ezra, and their questions constantly are dismissed as conspiracy theories. And that's why we're having so many problems right now, because government officials don't feel that it's necessary to answer people's questions. They feel that they can just pat them on the head. Oh, it's okay. Go away with your conspiracy theory, and then demonize and label anybody who wants to stand up and have truthful, honest discussions.
Well, I tell you, you're exactly right. And I see the CBC referred to recently talking about, oh, no one is asking anyone to eat crickets or eat bugs. And it's absurd. The so-called fact checkers, the ones accusing everyone else of believing in a conspiracy theory. I read that so-called fact check in the CBC. It's about that London area cricket food factory, and right in the primary document, the tweet from the firm that built the factory, it says for human and pet food. The word human comes first. Literally, the factory itself boasts that it's crickets for people to eat. And then the rest of the article is the CBC saying, oh, you'd have to be crazy to think we want people to eat crickets. Well, the factory builder just said so. You know what? I think instead of answering questions people have, they're smearing them, and that's not making the questions go away. I just brought in that crickets thing as an example of what you're talking about, the elites not actually answering questions. Hey, let me get back to the leadership race for a minute. We're coming down to final days. I think party members have until September 6th to return their ballot. Is that correct? Like, that's just a week away.
That is just a week away. And we will be picking up ballots because we don't want them. We want every vote to count. And so if people do have their ballots, we will send a courier. And we also have drop-off locations so that we could amass those ballots and save on some of the courier costs, because we are fiscal conservatives. So we'll find the most prudent way to get it in.
Well, the results will be released, I believe, 4 days later in Ottawa. I'll be there with some of the Rebel team. I think it's going to be very exciting. You are more seasoned as a candidate than you were last time. You've had a term as a member of parliament. This is not your first rodeo, as they would say. Now that we're coming into the final days, how do you think the campaign has gone? Not just for you, but in general. How would you describe the race this time as opposed to the last contest?
Ezra, it was very important for me to be able to articulate certain policy positions that I felt that were being buried in our party and that weren't being given a voice. And so that was one of my main objectives, is making sure that people have a voice and that they know that they have representation in Parliament. And so there are many issues that, as you would say, you rub the genie bottle and the genie's out of the bottle now. And so now we have to have these discussions. And so I'm very, very proud of myself for that, because I've traveled to 10 provinces and 3 territories, and I've heard the concerns of people, and it just doesn't seem that many parliamentarians are in tune with some of the issues that people find that are very, very important to them, such as our sovereignty, which is a primary issue right now.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly glad you're in the race. I think you've raised a lot of interesting issues, and you've done so in a politically incorrect way. What I mean by that is you're not more worried about what will he say or she say. You just say it. And I think that really clicks with people. I look forward to seeing you in Ottawa. Will you be in Ottawa for the announcement night on September 10th?
Absolutely, and I look forward to seeing you there too, Ezra.
Right on. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, and I just wanted to talk about this Nuremberg Code because I think it's important that everyone, it's not just a Jewish thing, of course, it's for anyone who cares about ethics, but the fact that some of your opponents were trying to flip it around on you, I thought I wanted to weigh in on and have a good discussion with you about it. Folks, I do encourage you to look up the Nuremberg Code and to read the rules of medical ethics that were devised by the court after the Holocaust. Very interesting, especially in the light of current events. Dr. Lewis, pleasure spending time with you. Your website is leslynlewis.ca, and we'll see you in just over a week in Ottawa.
Awesome. Thanks again, Ezra.
What you just saw was an excerpt from my nightly show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every weekday, I do a monologue. Usually it's about half an hour. Then I interview an interesting guest, and then we read my hate mail or my fan mail, whichever is more fun. It's only available behind a paywall, though. That's how we pay our bills here at Rebel News. We don't take a dime from Justin Trudeau. But the good news is it's only $8 a month, about half the price of Netflix. And in addition to my nightly show, you also get weekly shows from 4 other friends here at Rebel News. So you're getting 36 shows a month just for $8. I think it's worth it. And even if you're not quite sure, do it anyways, because we rely on viewers like you to keep us free and independent. I promise you I'll never take a dime from Trudeau. Just go to rebelnewsplus.com and click subscribe. Thanks.